Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started here. So I am going to kick things off over to Minna for a brief welcome and overview, and then we'll launch right in. So Minna, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Yumiko, and thanks for everybody who is here making time this Friday afternoon with us. We did set aside a couple of hours to be able to really dig into this topic and really appreciate you all setting aside that time for us. We may finish early, which would be a lovely gift on a Friday afternoon, but just know that this is a really complex learning collaborative. And we've hosted several of these learning collaboratives already. And this one is specific, as the others have been, to looking at the population and the youth's experience so that we can brainstorm ideas around what is the placement continuum we'd like to see for our young people in Colorado. Again, this is, I think, Yumiko, correct me, but I think this is our third learning collaborative that we have had so far. And there are more to come. So if you're interested in participating in any of the others, please let us know. What we aspire to do today is to really think outside of the box and innovatively about what we can bring to Colorado in terms of our placement continuum, identifying really what are the solutions that we need to serve the young people that we have in our care and our custody to the best of our ability. Again, focusing on the tenets of the Family First Prevention Services Act, but also just on the tenets of the work that Colorado has done, really the core values of strengthening families, making sure we're meeting kids and families where they are at to provide them the services that they need, and really seeing them as experts in their own family and recognizing that these families, if we work in partnership with them, that we can allow that voice and choice to help guide our practices and move our families to being able to move from our systems with just the supports that they need that will best serve them. There's special thanks here to so many of our staff who've been working hard on this in the Division of Child Welfare and OCYF. I just want to call out Gretchen and Yumiko and Dennis and Amy and Kristen and Angelina and Molly just for your efforts on this, really focusing in on, again, how are we going to think through what our roadmap is to going forward and serving our young people. We have great participation today from our folks in DYS as well. And I want to share how happy I am to see that we have placement providers. As I looked at the list of participants that are here, we have judges, our judicial folks, we have advocates that are here, both advocating for public safety as well as advocating for kids and families. And we have county staff that are here who work on serving kids and families. We have our Division of Child Welfare staff, our DYS staff, and other community treatment and support providers. And really, at the heart of this is really that we have our child placement folks at the table, our providers of these child care services and placement services, and want to share my gratitude with all of you for coming to help us think through this together, because as we do this collaborative effort, we will only do that more strongly and think through all the perspectives that are really important as we're making decisions about how we innovate and move Colorado forward. Super excited to say that on the child welfare side, through so many years of efforts in Colorado from our county partners, that we're seeing and maintaining the lowest level of out-of-home and congregate care placements that we have ever seen in Colorado's history, which is very exciting. And on the DYS side too, if you've been able to follow some of our work in our presentations, in 1920, DYS served 3,600 and 34 youth, and that's in detention, commitment, and on parole. And those are our lowest numbers since the 1980s. Like, it's tremendous. We see this major drop in the caseload that we're serving across DYS with this population. And what we are seeing is sadly a rise, a peak in some violent crime amongst our young people that mirrors some of the peaks that we're seeing in homicide and other person crimes in our adult community. But what that tells us is that we're doing a much better job on the front end here, shrinking the juvenile justice population, making sure that we are using all of our prevention efforts that are at our fingertips, and more that are coming under Family First to prevent out-of-home placement, including for this adjudicated delinquent population. This takes all of us again. It's a reduction in arrests, a reduction in juvenile delinquency court filings, new probation intakes, really a decline in those detained and those that are committed. And it really is, again, an effort from all of us who are seeing that adolescent brain development leads us to making different decisions, perhaps, and a shift to youth-centered, positive youth development approaches that we're using research to really guide our decision-making and understanding the impacts of childhood trauma on adolescents, and really taking those trauma-informed approaches to being able to serve our young people in a juvenile justice manner, and all of the reforms that have come together. And so I want to be able to call that out as well, is we are really managing in Colorado and across the nation with the reform of Family First, as well as these reforms that really help us reduce our juvenile justice populations. And so understanding that we have these reforms in place, and so we need to adapt and change our practices to meet the intent of those reforms, but also making sure that we're holding kids and families at the center of all of the decisions that we make. There's so many groups that have invested this effort and this commitment into achieving these outcomes. And so again, sharing gratitude with you all about that. And we're really excited about the next steps to implement these creative approaches. So for today, what we want to be able to do, and Yumiko will share a little bit more about that, is how do we really match a child or youth's unique gifts and their needs to the programs that are more dynamic, responsive, and high value, and that perhaps can provide those services to a child with their own family, with their kin, and not necessarily in a residential setting if it's not necessary. And when it is necessary, that we're putting those young people in placements that again meet their needs and can move them quickly in that treatment way versus just in a way that sort of gives them a place to stay. We are super excited again to do this with you all, and we need your help and your great ideas. And so thank you for spending again your Friday afternoon with us as we embark on this together. And with that, Yumiko, I'll send it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Minna, for that. Some encouraging words, and yes, welcome everyone to our third Placement Continuum Learning Collaborative, which is really focused in on the unique needs and opportunities around the juvenile justice population. My name is Yumiko Doherty. I'm with CDHS and currently serving as Chief Strategist for our Family First efforts. And before we dig in, I want to also introduce my co-presenters for today, Kristen Melton and Gretchen Russo. So Kristen, do you want to go off mute and introduce yourself quickly?
Water off. Sorry, I was having trouble with my video there. Hi, my name is Kristen Melton. I'm the Youth Services Manager in the Division of Child Welfare at CDHS. Thank you guys all for being here today.
Perfect. And Gretchen?
Hi, I'm Gretchen Russo, Judicial and Legislative Administrator for the Office of Children, Youth, and Families. And so nice to see so many names. I've already gotten some texts from people I haven't seen forever. So happy to see such a big crowd today for this important conversation.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Oops, not that quickly. We have 3 hours together this afternoon, and I think it's going to fly by quickly. We have some wonderful content to present to you, some great speakers lined up, and then some time set aside to really engage in some interactive, innovative discussions. So just to give you a sense of what's going to happen over the next few hours, I'm going to start by laying out the vision, our vision at the state level for the future placement continuum, as well as some important context for our discussions today. And then we're going to talk a bit about who is it that we're designing for and what are their needs. So getting into and grounding ourselves into the youth that we want to have close to our minds and our hearts as we have these discussions today. Next, we're going to hear from a panel of experts who are really out in the field leading and innovating and helping us all navigate this intersection between juvenile justice reform and child welfare reform. And our hope is that hearing from a variety of perspectives today, that can really help spur some new ideas and ways of thinking. And then finally, the last piece of today is going to be spent in smaller breakout group discussions. We hope that you stick with us to the end, because those small groups is really where it's all going to happen. We very intentionally called these learning collaboratives because we want to hear from all of you stakeholders and diverse perspectives together at the table to get your input and to help us think through what are the strategies and how do we move forward together. So starting off with our vision, and our vision is really grounded in three things. First, that we want to right size our placement continuum to be more responsive to the needs of children and youth in care. We want to ensure that when necessary, every child is either in a family-like setting or a small, high-quality treatment facility. And then finally, we want to ensure that all families have access to appropriate, responsive, and effective services at every level of the continuum. And we're going to be touching on each of these three things throughout the day. So again, really grounding our design from a youth-centered perspective and their needs, and then designing around that. We're going to talk a lot about how to develop alternative options to residential care. And the only way to make those options successful and viable is to ensure that we have robust, diverse services for our youth and families. So a little bit of context, as I'm sure all of you are feeling and are well aware of, there is a lot of major reform happening in Colorado. So we have the Federal Family First Prevention Services Act that many of you on today's call have been engaged in one way or another in terms of the statewide planning and preparation for implementation around that. But then also at the state level, we have some major child welfare and juvenile justice reform that's been happening over the last couple years, as well as our behavioral health system. The governor's behavioral health task force recently wrapped up and is moving forward with implementing their blueprint for reform. And then finally, institutions for mental diseases, the IMD issue, which is not necessarily a reform, but it is certainly interacting with all of these pieces to have a major significant impact on our placement continuum. And so in an attempt to visually show how all these reforms are working together to impact our continuum, in a very, very simplified manner, I am going to attempt to show you. So in the current state, when a child or youth has to be placed out of home, they either go to a family-like setting, which consists of kinship homes, certified and non-certified, as well as traditional foster homes, or there's a set of congregate care settings, so group homes, group centers, and residential child care facilities, RCCFs. What Family First does is it says that the federal government is no longer going to reimburse states for certain levels of congregate care placement. So how that translates in Colorado is we will no longer receive federal payment for placements in group homes, group centers, or RCCFs. Instead, that law really tries to incentivize and prioritize keeping kids safely at home with their families through the provision of prevention services. And when that's not possible, ensuring they're either in a family-like setting or in a treatment-focused residential facility when there's a clinical need to do so. So as you can see from this diagram, right, effectively, we're kind of moving away from the middle, saying kids either need to be in a family-like setting or in a high-level treatment facility when necessary. Now, on top of this, what IMD is doing, and we could have a whole session on IMD, but IMD is really impacting Medicaid reimbursement, and that's at these high-level treatment-focused facilities. And so the ultimate impact of IMD is saying that for this highest level of care, oh, and I should have mentioned, sorry, you see QRTPs there. Family First created this new higher level treatment focused level of care called Qualified Residential Treatment Programs. What IMD is doing is essentially saying, if we want to continue accessing Medicaid reimbursement for children and youth in those highest levels of care for treatment, then it puts a cap on the number of beds that those facilities are able to have. So for individual QRTPs, they need to have 16 beds or less in order to continue receiving Medicaid reimbursement. So most of our RCCFs, which are transitioning into QRTPs today, are well over that 16 bed limit. So we need to find a way not only to move along in the continuum of more treatment focused, high quality care, but also figure out how to decrease our capacity at that level. So those challenges in and of themselves are enough. But on top of that, if we layer on juvenile justice reform, as well as some of the limitations on detention, the challenge before us starts becoming clearer and clearer. Because historically speaking, for our juvenile justice youth that need to be placed out of home, typically the easiest, quickest setting is in that congregate care level. And family first and child welfare reform is really pushing us away from using that level of care. And so overall, the challenge for all of us along the continuum is to really think through how can the needs of higher acuity children and youth who have historically been in congregate care levels of settings, how can we meet their needs at lower levels of care? How can we build up alternative options to residential treatment? How can we ensure a robust service array to wrap around these children, youth, and families to ensure they're successful and keep them out of some of these residential options that we've relied on in the past? And then I think, you know, at the heart of it, of both juvenile justice reform and child welfare reform, the underlying principles are very similar, right? They're about getting youth home or keeping them at home, ensuring they're in the least restrictive settings possible, ensuring that when we are placing, it is not just for containment, but is because there is a true treatment need. And so the underlying principles are the same. I think the challenge is that they're all happening at the same time. And so this is really accelerating the urgency and the timeline for us to come together and figure out how to adapt our continuum of care and refine our continuum of care over the next several months. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who's going to present some data to put some numbers around this, kind of what our current numbers look like around this population and these levels of care. So Kristen.
All right, thanks, Yumiko. So we have two data points to share with you today to give a little bit of a sense of scale and context of who are the young people that we're talking about, or rather not who they are, but where are they currently and how did they wind up in our system. Excuse me, dog barking. So this first slide shows the youth who are in congregate care by the type of placement. And so this includes youth who are in congregate care due to a program area 4 case, which is what we call youth in conflict cases that often are young people who have come to the attention of the Department of Human Services due to a delinquency matter, but not always. But it's a youth in conflict case is a PA4, as opposed to a PA5, which is a child protection case, meaning that the case is open due to concerns of abuse or neglect. And then also PA6, Program Area 6, which are specialized services. Often that can mean that they have a case open in trails due to adoption subsidies, although there can be other reasons as well. So this shows you all the young people in all of those program areas who are in congregate care. And as you can see, about 3/4 of them are in a residential placement, such as an RCCF. And then we have a very small number, 9, who are in hospital or psychiatric care, and about 1/4 that are in group homes. Of those different program areas that I described, which we'll show you in a second, those the distribution is about the same across program area. They tend to be at the same rate roughly in those placement types. The only exception is that the hospital stay youth tend to be the program area 5 abuse and neglect child protection concern cases. And so here we have our young people who are currently, or were as of December, the same number of young people, just looking at it differently, showing how they came to be in the system, whether they're in a program area 5, program area 4, program area 6. And as you can see, most of the young people are either PA4 or PA5. A little bit more of them are in a child protection case, and then slightly fewer are in a youth in conflict case.
Thank you, Kristen. And so going from the current system and all the various reforms to what we are imagining in the future state, This is a visual of how we envision the future placement continuum. And you can see, compared to the first graphic I put up, compared to the current state, what we're aiming for is a much more diversified, refined continuum of care that, again, is truly responsive to the unique needs of children, youth, and families, and that at every single level has robust community-based wraparound services. So in this graphic, you can see, right, that our vision is really reflected here, where the continuum ranges from those in-home prevention services all the way through treatment-focused settings, QRTPs, PRTFs, and we included the division of youth services here as well as a treatment up at the higher end of the continuum. And then there's everything else in between. And that's where some of this innovative work is happening right now that we're looking to build out and evolve. So for example, in the family-like settings column, we had last week a learning collaborative that was focused in on building out a new level of care within that therapeutic foster home, and also expanding treatment foster homes. So again, diversifying within each of these levels so we can be more responsive and more refined based on the needs of children and youth. Before we move on, just a quick plug for those of you who are interested in learning more about the intersections of the juvenile justice system and Family First. The Juvenile Justice Work Group under the Family First implementation team put together a wonderful visual that's essentially a flow chart of the juvenile justice system. And it visually shows all the various touch points or opportunities to consider prevention services as well as placement assessment. And so we will, in our follow-up communications to all of you, be sure to include this visual, because if nothing else, it's a good conversation starter with your partners to understand, again, where are the opportunities and places where you might need to slow down and consider some of these alternative routes. So we'll include that. I believe this graphic was just finalized recently, so we're excited to share that out. It's a great resource. So now just moving on to this idea of youth-centered design. And I love this quote. I think this is really where we need to come from today, and probably always. The people we're designing for are the roadmap to innovative solutions. So the more we can understand the children and youth and their needs and who we're designing for, they are the ones that are going to point us to the innovation and the best ideas and solutions. And if we take a human-centered design approach, which we're doing a very, very accelerated version of here, human-centered design really says it's at the intersection of these three things is where kind of the innovative, high-impact ideas come. It's the intersection of desirability, which is coming at things from the human aspect, viability or the business aspect of things, and feasibility, all those technical considerations. And so what we're looking for is the overlap of those three things. But in every single human-centered design challenge, you always start with what's desirable. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So again, really digging into, from a youth-centered perspective, what is the range of services, supports, and alternative levels of care that we want to create that would best suit their needs. All the questions about viability and feasibility are absolutely necessary, and we're going to have to get there very soon. But for today, we're just going to focus on what's desirable. What do we want to create? And try to set aside all the other various barriers and considerations just for a little bit, so we can be as innovative as possible and dream big together. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Gretchen. I asked her to provide an overview again, thinking about this specific population, juvenile justice youth, and kind of bringing us down another level to really think through the various touch points again throughout the system and the youth that we're really talking about today as we move forward in our design phase. So Gretchen?
Yeah, thanks, Miko. So I would just welcome anyone to give us additional thoughts if you think we've missed a population. But the reality, we've gone over this a couple of times in our juvenile justice group, but and on the detention or the juvenile justice flow chart. But the reality is we recognize that these different populations may need supports or out-of-home placement. And so as we have conversations today, we really want to think about these different populations. So the first one we recognize are those youth who maybe have been arrested and have screened out of detention. They may not be able to go home because of either a victim in the home or the needs that they may have. And so what are we looking at as supports for them or even placements? And hopefully at a lower level, but knowing that that really depends on the needs of that individual youth. The other one are those kids who are in detention and then deemed eligible by the court, but also maybe not able to go back to their own home. So what are we thinking about and as support for that young person? Can it be kin? Can it be a foster home, more family-like setting? Or what are their treatment needs that would require a higher level of care? The other one is crossover youth, and I want to just be really clear, that is defined in statute. I know all of the judicial districts have their own crossover youth plans, and they do change a little bit depending on how you defined at your local level. So this really, from our vantage point for this conversation, are those who have a current open dependency neglect case and then subsequently pick up the delinquency charge. So the department still is required to find placement, but what do those additional charges maybe need to be looked at as far as ongoing placement? And so it's not necessarily always a new youth to the county, but what are those additional needs that maybe need to be identified and addressed? Then pre-adjudicated. So we often know that there are, once again, youth who are maybe go back home, are on pretrial release, but then there's some things that are happening that we recognize they need additional supports. And so you may be asked to look at supporting a pre-adjudicated youth, whether services or out-of-home placement. Then sentenced to out of the home. I just want to expand on this one a little bit more. As you all know, youth who are delinquent most often are sentenced to probation. So they are not usually just out of the gate sentenced to out of home, but usually as probation is going along, they might not be complying, they might have their probation revocated. And so just knowing that that is an option for a young person who is on probation. The last one, and we didn't want to leave this off, although I know that a number of folks here recognize that once a youth is committed, they come into the state department's custody, but recognizing that some do come back out either to their families or to the counties for other supports. And so we wanted to really highlight the full continuum. And once again, if folks are feeling like, wow, there's a big population that you missed on here, please let us know. But this is the population, these are the populations we've been talking about over the years. And so once again, feel free to use the chat if you have any comments on any of these populations, but keep in mind that as we talk about the scenarios later today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gretchen. And to bring this down even another level, the team around me has really done such a great job of building out these 6 use cases for us to really ground our discussions in today. And so when we go to our small breakout sessions, all of you are going to get to know one of these young people much better and read some background into some specific examples around characteristics and needs and where they happen to be in the system to build solutions specifically around that youth and what's happening in his or her life. So these are fictional cases, but again, they're meant to really ground us in that youth-centered perspective as we think through kind of innovative design and a comprehensive way to meet a youth's needs. So that's to come in our small group sessions, and you'll be able to read the full use case once you get into your group. And the question that we're really going to answer today, once you read through your use case, is how can we meet the needs of these identified children and youth? So you're going to have to consider things like services, right? What are all the various wraparound services, formal and informal, evidence-based and not evidence-based, that the youth could benefit from? How do we really build out least restrictive environments and various different options for the youth if needed? And community-based alternatives residential. So that's just a look ahead at what's going to happen in our small breakout sessions. But before we get there, we're going to come to probably the most exciting piece of this first half, which is really hearing from different voices out in the field who are engaging with these youth, who are engaging in the work, and already digging into some innovative solutions for moving forward. The purpose here is not to say this is the way forward, this is the solution, but rather to give you ideas and thoughts to bring into your small group discussion, to give you some different perspectives from different points of view in the system, and expand kind of some of your thoughts. So there's two parts to our panel today. The first part is really going to focus in on staffings and services. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen and Norma to talk through about some really exciting things that are happening in that area. And then the second half of the panel is going to be from hearing from some of our judicial officers. So getting that court and legal perspective around these issues. And Gretchen's going to be leading that panel. So I'm going to go over and turn this to Kristen and Norma to lead us through this first section.
Thank you, Yumiko. I am not sure if Norma's on yet. I know she was going to be joining us right about now, and I think we might be a few minutes ahead of schedule. So
do you want us to do the judicial part first then? Gretchen, I don't know if we have all three of those panelists ready to go.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's do that if that's okay, Kristen, and we'll give Norma a chance to get on and get settled.
Great, thanks. I'll keep an eye on the participants and tag you when she gets
here. Perfect.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, we see some of the questions in the chat, so I will address those in a minute once we get some of the panel going. But first of all, a huge thank you to the panel. I will be honest, early this week as we started final preparation, we were like, we really need to have court input. So all three of these wonderful people listed here were contacted midweek and said, can you come help present on Friday? And they all graciously agreed. So a huge thank you to Jennifer, Judge Moultrie, and Magistrate Dumler. With that, I'd like to have each of them go ahead and introduce themselves briefly, and then we're going to start with Jennifer. So Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Mullenbeck. I'm the Deputy County Attorney in Jefferson County, and I am here on behalf of our entire best practice team in the first JD.
Yes. Judge Moultrie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pax Moultrie. I'm a judicial officer judge in Denver Juvenile Court. I've been in that position since April of last year. Prior to that, I was in Jefferson County for about 14 months handling some delinquency, some DNN, a lot of DR work. And prior to that, I was a county attorney in both Arapahoe and Jefferson counties for many years here.
Great. Great. Thanks, Judge. And Magistrate Dumler.
I was lucky enough to have Pax in my courtroom for a little while. I miss seeing you. This is the only way I get to see you anymore. I've been a magistrate with the 18th Judicial District for 17 years. I started working in juvenile in 2003, so 14 years. Working in juvenile, and right now my docket is juvenile delinquents and a little bit of DNN.
Yeah, and so with that, I think one of the reasons we really felt like it was important to have judicial and court representation and legal representation was we often hear, well, the court, they make us do this, or they're the ones who order. And at the end of the day, they absolutely are. But we wanted to give some perspective on how you can work with your court, some perspectives from judicial officers on when they're making those orders, and then just hearing from them about some of the needs that they're seeing from the young people that appear in front of them who are involved in the delinquency court. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to just talk about their collaboration in Jefferson County. And I think Yumiko is going to drive the slides, Jennifer. So there you go.
Great, thank you. So yeah, just to give you kind of an idea of what I'm going to talk about today, I want to talk a little bit about our framework of our best practice team.
Actually, my piece isn't for a little bit now, I guess, is what they're just telling me. So I'll do it in just a second.
Okay, and then what I want to talk about is just a couple specific things that we have implemented in our jurisdiction that other people may feel free to, borrow from, take in whole, or just take pieces of it. So our best practice team started many years ago, and when we first started, we were just a dependency and neglect best practice team with just a core group of individuals. And over the years, we have expanded into multiple teams. So our core best practice team became our steering committee. At one point, we felt like we had a lot of permanency issues that we needed to address. So we created that subcommittee. And then about 3 years ago, we created our juvenile delinquency best practice team. And then with Family First coming on board, we started that probably about a year ago. So we had been working under this framework of the different groups for a while now. Our delinquency group, we originally started talking about decreasing our congregate care levels, but realized what we were really talking about was having better permanency outcomes for all of our kids, but particularly those in our delinquency framework, where I think sometimes that gets lost in all the other things that were going on. And as we were trying to start that, we had all the reforms that Yumiko talked about come up. We had the crossover youth come up. We had the juvenile justice reform. Family First obviously impacted it. And then on top of that, we had COVID. And so I think all of those things can be seen as challenges, but I think in some ways they actually pushed us a little bit further along and more quickly than we really intended to go, or people thought they were comfortable with, because those things were telling us, one is with Family First, we were seeing some of our congregate care providers just drop out of the game because they knew they weren't going to last under Family First. So we had less of those placements even to start with. Juvenile justice reform is obviously very much focused on kids not being in detention, which pushed people to talk about how kids can stay home and with relatives more safely. And then with COVID, when we were, and still in some cases are unable to allow kids and parents to see each other, that really pushed all of us to say these kids and these youth need to get home more quickly because they need to have contact with their families. So I think that's where we're at this point. A couple things I would just talk about is obviously with our delinquency team, we brought in players we had never had before. Our probation, our SB 94, juvenile assessment center people, our public defenders, our alternative defense counsel, our DAs, and then our county attorneys and human services had been there before, but in a different role. And what I wanted to say is I think it hasn't been without its challenges, but I think it's been important for all of us to come together. What we really thought we were going to do at the beginning is kind of come to this consensus that everybody was going to use the same language and we were going to have the same goals, concrete goals, not just overarching goals. And I think I would call that maybe a miss that we had, that we realized we probably couldn't get that close together. As everyone knows, our systems have different language, they have different objectives, and that really wasn't going to be feasible. So I think we've shifted our practice or our approach over time to really talk about that we were going to learn more about each other's systems. We were going to find ways that we overlapped, but didn't necessarily always agree or do the exact same thing. And then we did come to some agreements about overarching goals and that each person's going to play a different role in it, and each system is. It doesn't mean we still don't have disagreements. It doesn't mean that we don't agree on the level of placement or that we have concerns about lower level placements. But I think we have more discussions now about it. And I think a lot of those are occurring outside of court now instead of on the record in court. So Yumiko, do you want to go to the next slide? There we go. So I'll just touch really briefly on our crossover youth process, and this can be a handout if anyone wants to look at it. But really what we focused in on our jurisdiction, I'm not going to go through the whole chart here, is information sharing across our systems so that the DAs and the PDs and the JAC were having the same information that we had in child welfare about a youth's history to make sure that that informed the decisions that were being made in the delinquency cases. The other piece we really focused on was family engagement, even if you weren't involved in the child welfare system, and had to coordinate among our agencies on how we were going to make that happen. And then regardless of which system you came in through or which systems you were involved with, we really focused on having one plan for the family that encompassed all of their requirements, not having the child welfare treatment plan or the probation terms of probation, but really bringing it all together. And this is something we're definitely still working on and working through, but that is our goal for crossover youth. Yumiko, you want to do the next slide? And then the other piece that we've done in our jurisdiction has really been around social services involvements in delinquency cases. So we, a couple years ago, started a placement evaluation, a formal written placement evaluation that child welfare would do. One of the first things we did is we shifted the focus from just being a placement evaluation to being a services evaluation as well. We really felt like placement isn't the only thing that social services or child welfare provides, and that services are often what people are talking about, not necessarily placing youth out of the home. So in order to standardize that across the entire jurisdiction, we developed an order that can be used by any judicial officer in our judicial district. And it's a checkbox, and there is a sample that I gave you, Miko, that can be shared with everybody. That just tells the department what they want them to do. Do you want me to look for placement and services, just placement? Do you want me to evaluate whether a dependency and neglect petition is necessary? And then also just ask the court to identify quickly for us where they wanted us to focus our assessment. When we were getting these initially, we didn't have a lot of information about that. So now it at least identifies, is substance abuse a concern? Is domestic violence? Is the youth behavior? Is it all of those things? So that we're tailoring our report to what the court's concerned about. And then we also added an option on whether the court wants us to appear by report or in person to give information. And then we did cite to the information statutes that allow particularly child welfare to receive information from the delinquency court around what the other assessments are being done and what they're saying. The other piece that we streamline is the court emails it to one email address, and then child welfare is responsible for getting it to all the right people, so that the judicial officer didn't have to be responsible for that and didn't have to spend time on the phone calling in referrals, or sometimes we found those orders were just getting lost. So the second part of what we did, and we can do the next slide, Yumiko, is that we did, as I said before, finalized our placement and services evaluation. So this is a standardized format that is used by every caseworker who submits a report that has areas that we think are important for everyone to know about, including not only about the youth, but their home, about their parents, about their siblings, about their prior contact with the department. And we share that with the court and all of the parties prior to any hearing that we need to report back on this, so that people have the opportunity to review it. One of the main reasons we started this is we knew caseworkers were doing really thorough assessments, but court moves quickly, and there are a lot of cases, and we were really only be given a couple minutes to try to explain everything that we had assessed and everything that we had looked at and everything we were recommending, and we just found that it wasn't enough. So that's why we started it. And then the next big piece, obviously, which is what the court is probably looking for the most, is what are the next steps and what are our recommendations? There are lots of services that can be provided outside of child welfare and don't need our involvement. And so have we made sure to connect those people and get those referrals done and get everything done? And if child welfare does need to be involved, this is how we see our involvement there. So those were the big things we did. The other piece that we really pushed in our delinquency cases was our family engagement meetings, which I know those are called all different things all over the state. And we really pushed for those to occur before we submit this evaluation and report to the court and the parties. And we found that to be really useful in terms of our disagreements about where youth particularly need to go. And we've tried to shift the conversation from people saying, I think this level of care is necessary, but really, what do I need to say as probation or the GAL or the DA to keep this youth at home, either with their family or with their kin? And I think when we talk that through and we have that, it's a different conversation that pushes us closer together on an agreement. The big piece, and I think this was already mentioned, is to have this work, you've got to have services, and you've got to have a lot of different services available that can be provided timely. So that was our big commitment, was we would wrap services around these families and these youth, and we would do it in a timely way. Another piece that our jurisdiction has really been focusing on is the idea of leaning into risk. And so we have done at least, excuse me, 2 trainings for our entire judicial district around decision-making and leaning into risk and what really is a concern that necessitates a higher level of care and what is a setback or a treatment issue. So meaning, you know, a positive UA doesn't necessarily mean that you revoke and that the youth has to go to a higher level care. It means we have to sit down and talk about it again, decide if we have the right services in place, and have more family meetings to keep reassessing. And so that was really what I wanted to focus on. The only other thing I would say is that we are continuing to do ongoing trainings. In February, we have our juvenile delinquency partners who will be presenting at our best practice team for our judicial district on how Family First is impacting them. So even though we have these separate groups, we do try to have a lot of crossover in terms of our training and working on the issues together. And I did see, and I'm sorry, I haven't been able to follow all of the chat, but I did see about the wait list on providers. Yes, I mean, that's still a factor and it's still an issue, and we don't always hit the mark on that. I think for us, the big thing is trying to find more providers so that we have smaller wait lists. And then also we do have some providers who can come in on like a crisis, I don't know if crisis is right, but like a short-term immediate time, so that we can provide those services while we're waiting for more comprehensive services. So I know that was a lot. Gretchen, anything else from me, or is that everything?
No, I think so. And I just really want to thank you again. Jennifer and I were able to present to the Juvenile Judges Institute in October with some other professionals, and really, I felt like there was so much going on in Jefferson County that folks could learn from, to have that local conversation, that it's important to have it at the local level because there are things that are different across the state, but wanting to just highlight some of the things they've done and some of the things that they're still doing in hopes of folks being able to learn from that and maybe take some of those moving forward in their own jurisdiction. So thank you again, and we'll kind of monitor to see if there's other questions. With that, we're going to turn to Judge Moultrie just to hear a little bit about her experience in Denver and kind of the things that she's noticed over the years around this population. So Judge Moultrie.
Hi, so I guess I was, listening to Yumiko's introduction, and I guess one thing I would say is that I'm not an expert. I know some things about some things, but especially in this judicial role, I think one thing that I can give to people is know that about your judicial officers, is that kind of know where they're coming from, what their experience is, because we may not all have been dealing with these populations in the same way. And I know there's been a number of new judicial officers in the past year or two. So you may have somebody who's rotating in to deal with juvenile justice matters or crossover youth issues who doesn't really have any experience in it. What I can say, what I found is that I think dealing with these youth populations, the more kind of collaboration and cooperation you have on the front end, I just think it's more successful. I'm still getting to know Denver, so frankly, with respect to specific questions, probably Rose Editor, who's I know in the room, may have better information than I do. But I think, you know, Denver's done a really nice job of having those discussions, working cooperatively and collaboratively on these issues. And so, especially since I've been there, what I've noticed is that I think, and I hope we're doing a good job of keeping kids in the juvenile justice system with the delinquency cases out of detention or out of high levels of care. A lot of times those are the kids who really kind of need to be there. Otherwise, they've already gone through an assessment process at the JAC. There's already been a discussion, and a lot of times they're just coming in on summons, or there's already services in place through pretrial or probation has dealt with it, things like that. I guess what I would just encourage to is that, you know, really it's the practitioners and the families who are the experts. And so that's who I'm looking to hear from in court is, you know, my primary questions are always who, how, when, and why, you know, just kind of those nouns of how are we going to get this done? Who's responsible for it? Really, what are we trying to accomplish? Those kind of questions. So those are the types of things I ask in court. As far as my prior practice, again, you know, as a county attorney, my role was slightly different in the sense that I was advocating on behalf of the department. And so, you know, but what I was trying to do is have those discussions outside of court, try to understand where the department was coming from, what it is they felt they could offer, also talking with, you know, defense counsel or DAs about their concerns about community safety and things along those lines, and trying to get as much information as I could to bring to the court. Because the fact of the matter is that even though I sit on the bench and I'm making the decision, a lot of times I have the least amount of information in the room to make the decision. So the more information you can give me about how I can try to make those decisions is always welcome. And Gretchen, I don't know if they answered your question. I keep getting this message that my internet connection is wonky, so hopefully I'm coming through okay.
You are coming through. It's a little choppy, but not too bad. I think the last thing I would just ask is, both from your time with Arapahoe to Jeffco to even Denver, what are some of the needs of the youth you're seeing? Because I think part of today is really hearing about, you know, is it substance use, is it mental health, is it services for the family just to keep the youth in the home? What are some of the trends or topics that you've been seeing in your different roles?
All of the above. Yep, certainly, you know, mental health for parents, mental health for youth, substance use for parents and youth. Frankly, gang violence issues are, I think, something that we don't necessarily have a good handle on to address therapeutically. And so I think I welcome any conversation about that. Respite is something I think that we have a dearth of for our juvenile population. You know, we've got it for littler kids, but, you know, not necessarily a 16-year-old who might need to, might need some more structure or just a break from maybe family or, you know, particular provider. I don't recall, or I feel like I haven't seen a lot of that. It seems to be either you're in the home and we're trying to wrap a lot of services, which is great, or you're out of the home in detention or placement. And then you kind of get into that cycle, unfortunately, of the youth who run because they want to get home, but they also necessarily won't stay home. And so we get into the cycle of moving towards higher and higher levels of care because of some of those concerns and behaviors that are being displayed.
Great, thank you. And I know we have some questions in the chat, but I really want to make sure we get some time with Magistrate Dumbler. And so, Magistrate Dumbler, do you want to talk about some of the work you guys have been doing down in Arapahoe?
Sure. So I would start by just saying, you know, when I started in Douglas, right after I started taking over the juvenile delinquent docket, we were asked to participate in House Bill 1451. So in 2009, we put that together, and ultimately that morphed into crossover. So early on in Douglas, I had the experience of working with professionals in a very collaborative way that was very eye-opening. What I will tell you about juvenile delinquents is if they don't screen out to diversion, if they're not out in diversion, this is a first offense, this, you know, they don't belong in the judicial system, they're screened out, and they persist in coming back over and over again. What I'm going to tell you, those kids who are at risk of being placed have mental health issues, developmental delays, or child abuse or neglect, poor parenting. Of the kids I've sentenced to DYS or put in out-of-home placement, the kids that when we did psych evals or mental health evals that came back with nothing, with no mental health treatment issues, I can count on one hand out of the thousands of kids I've worked with. So to me, it's always been a myth that we're placing kids just to contain them, because I don't think that you can find a whole lot of that unless people are really truly just using that as a first line of defense instead of services. But it's quite an eye-opener to go from a really collaborative system where your primary issues really, we had mental health kids, adoption failures a lot in Douglas, sex assault cases and drug cases were really the bulk of what we were dealing with in Douglas. When I moved to Arapahoe, your first day in Arapahoe is somewhat shocking. Here's kind of a list of the things that give us the most trouble and we see most frequently: robberies, assaults, assault in the second degree and third, that could be both, handguns, aggravated motor vehicle theft with eluding of officers, armed robbery, bank robberies. If you can believe it, I've had a bunch of those. Attempted homicide, gang activity, substance abuse, and child trafficking are really substantive issues that we had to face. That's quite a shock when you go from mostly misdemeanor court to major felony court. And so when I got there and I got everybody together to figuring that we probably all were collaborating like everybody else was around the state, I was told by social services that the juvenile delinquents are not our responsibility. We don't have any role there, thanks. Obviously that wasn't going to fly, and I've pushed very hard in the last 3 years to move us forward. I'm thrilled to say that we do now have our crossover up, we have our CMP up, and we have brought to the table some really wonderful programs that I just want to share a few with you to think about. One of our ISSTs in the 1451 that we built was built by DHS. You know, you always hear this conversation, if we could just get them earlier. You know that the kindergarten teacher knows, you know the first grade teacher knows that there's a problem right up front. You know, if this kid is running around biting other kids and they can't settle them down, that's an issue that you need to address. It's not a child abuse issue, but it is an issue that's intervention would be extremely helpful and likely prevent further penetration into the system and likely the JD down the road. Well, they built that system for us. So they actually went out to the schools, all of our school districts, and they actually, what used to happen when I first got there was the school would not talk to DHS because they had just burned bridges. They said, you know, we call them all the time, we're doing exactly what you're saying, and we get the answer, you didn't qualify for services, it's not serious enough, so not meeting criteria, boom, you're out, no help. So they got very frustrated and just stopped asking. What they were able to do with this new program is they were able to go to the schools and say, we know you're going to screen out at that lower level, but we still want those cases on a preventative basis. And so the school principal or dean or whoever it is will make a referral and say, we're seeing these things. Could you put together a voluntary family engagement meeting and see if we could make a difference? Now that was a leap of faith for Arapahoe County to do, to really put it out there and really put the resources in. When budgets are tight and things are blowing up everywhere. That was a hard, I think, thing for them to do, but it's paying off in strides. And Michelle Dossie is running that program for them if you have any questions or want to kind of pick her brain about it. But I'm pretty sure that she showed me numbers that were, you know, touching thousands of kids a year. So really intervening at that nice early level when the problems are small and fixable. And we can engage with the family so it's not so adversarial down the road, and bring to the table that social services can actually be a benefit and a partner for your family, not something to fear or, you know, reject just automatically. So that's been really, really great that we brought to the table. They also took a leap of faith with us. We stole, and he still works for them, but we borrowed heavily from DYS on their program where they reintegrate kids back into the community. Daniel Sampson heads up Driven by Our Ambitions. And one of the things that they do for us is we get them into that family where I'm going to tell you flat out, FFT and MST do not work with gang involved families. They don't work with a lot of minority families. It's just, we've really struggled with those services, and I know they're the go-to, but for that population, they just didn't work. What did work was combining mental health services, getting a good mental health eval if that's there, or developmental delays, whatever the issue is there, or whether it's just parenting, and they mentor the family. We're hiring them to mentor the kid, but what it's turned out to be is they are also giving resources to the parents that they actually are familiar with. Their focus is on minorities. They want to have cultural competence and work with that family. And what we've found is the families, even though we're paying them and we're ordering them, perceive them as not part of the system. They perceive them as someone who's helping them. And the kids that we have been able to turn around from gangs, and kids that I sentenced a kid the other day with 9 cases. We were just about to have to go to DYS when this program went into place. And they mentored him, they got him a job, they showed him how important it was to do good in school. They're very big into teaching kids about starting their own business and being entrepreneurial. They have a record studio, so these kids who happen to be inclined musically, who want to maybe rap or something like that, they have this studio where they're allowed to do that. They have a barbershop where they can intern there, they can get trained there. They have construction programs so that they can really get these meaningful jobs and really teach them about how to get in school and how to be successful in the community, as opposed to stealing. One of the things that was kind of shocking about understanding some of these kids was they were robbing to pay for things. They were robbing people to sometimes pay the rent or get food in the house because their parents weren't. Sometimes it was a pair of shoes or phones or things that they wanted to have in their life that they saw other kids having and they had to go without. Well, this program has really reached in and hit that need and said, you can have all that. And here's the legal way to do it that's going to not cause you trouble. The court's going to be out of your face and you're going to go on to lead a nice life. But they're also mentoring the parents too. The amount of kids that we have gotten out of placement or avoided placement with that service in combination with some other services has been really remarkable. We do use GRID also for gangs, but that doesn't always work. It's a totally voluntary program. You can't order it. So sometimes I can't go that route. But I think we're putting together some groundbreaking services at a really early level and a high intervention level that I think, I really think that it's going to become models for the state. And I give kudos to Arapahoe DHS for really seeing the vision and working with us. We have a lot more on the plate. We also really want to heavily incentivize kids when they do right. We want everybody in the room to be just clapping their hands for them. So some of you may know our building is right next to the Broncos. And so what we did is we did it the year before. We asked if one of them would be interested in coming to our incentive court. Every kid who goes on probation, we set for 6-month incentive, hoping they're going to successfully complete. And we put that in their head day one. Work hard and let's get out of here early. And we did have a Bronco who was on the practice squad that year come and actually talk to the kids, take selfies with the kids. It was great. And we saw the power in that. Well, this year, the Broncos reached out to us because of COVID and they had to be remote. They were struggling to find opportunities for community service for the Broncos. So we asked them if they would join our incentive court, and they did, and it was amazing. And if anybody's interested, I have some of the videos. And we got major players to come, and they were each assigned a kid. They would write in their incentive court letter, this is what I overcame, this is what I changed, this is the mental health stuff I did, and these are my goals for the future. We gave those to the Broncos a week in advance, and then they would make a little video for the kids. And then surprisingly, we had incentive court, they all jumped on. I thought they wouldn't probably come and take the time to do that. They jumped on our court and they talked to the kids, and just some of the changes those kids made because these men were able to tell them their story. Many of them, you would be surprised, came from backgrounds where they have already seen this play out. Everybody they knew was in jail or had gone down the wrong road, and they were the only one that chose right. Garrett Bowles came, Melvin Gordon, just Tim Patrick. I mean, big Bronco players. And I think, you know, with the combination of services, incentives, and showing them to walk that right path and really pushing them to be their absolute best, I think that we're doing some pretty amazing things. So I don't know if I answered everything you wanted, but.
I think a lot. I think, first of all, thank you again. And I think just being able to share some of the conversations you've been able to have. I know that some folks feel like, oh, having this work with the judge outside the courtroom, how do we do this? So I appreciate you and Judge Moultrie being able to kind of comment on some of that, as well as Jennifer. There's some amazing comments and questions in the chat. We're gonna spend just a little bit of time with those, but I know we have other presenters today. First of all, I think Magistrate Dumler, there was a question about the service, and I think it's Daniel Sampson. I see him in parole, but is that, I think that's a question folks were asking, but do you want to just give another, can you just define that a little bit better for everyone?
Sure, I'll try. So we found him, he actually contacted us. He works for DYS, he has a contract with them doing that integrative service where, so let's say they're paroling out, they put that mentor on, and they can probably speak to what they pay for better than I can, but my impression is doing exactly what he's bringing to the table for us pre-adjudication. He was getting frustrated that, you know, he was hitting the game too late, but getting them jobs, getting them an education, making sure that they have positive role models, and being that voice in the back of their head. You don't want to play it that way when they're about to blow it and it's brought to their attention. Really jumping in. You know, they've done things for us like the parents, GALs, caseworker. We can't get the school to get the computer for the kid so that they can be on online school. And he just went and did it and found the right person, walked into school and got it done. It's just one of the things that, well, they do so many different things, but their focus is really how to be a successful, and it's mostly men, a successful man, and they have mostly male mentors. One of the mentors that he employs actually went through the DYS system, and then he did so well. He was very gang involved. He had to leave the state in order to really extract himself from that. So they sent him to college. He played football, and he was drafted by the Jets. And he played for a year. So he's there, he's walked this too. So, you know, getting that experience to say, I've been there and I know the way out has been really powerful for us. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And I think as a follow-up, we can make sure and send information. I'm not guaranteeing that Daniel's taking on new folks or anything, but we can put information in the follow-up. The other thing is, and it's such an important point, and actually when we talked with Judge Moultrie yesterday, talking about minority overrepresentation and just what we're seeing in the juvenile justice system, I don't want to belittle the conversation by having it very quickly, but I do think it's important, just maybe if Judge Moultrie or Jennifer or Magistrate Dumler, if each of you had just a comment on any of the work you're doing around this topic or anything that you would like to comment on regarding that.
I'll just say, just to follow up, because we were just talking about Daniel Sampson.
I guess what I would say is just kind of piggyback off of Magistrate Dumler.
Go ahead, Judge.
Sorry, that's my internet connection. I apologize. Maybe I'll try to slow down. Can you hear me okay?
It's kind of in and out, but we can hear you.
All right, I'll just briefly say, I think that goes to some of the programming that Dumler was talking about driven by our ambitions. I'm not aware of a specific therapeutic service to address the issue that we raised in the processing that as, you know, a young Black or brown person in the system, other than some of the things that Magistrate Dumler has already talked about. That being said, I think that some of that is where it goes back to collaboration in the flow chart that Gretchen or Yumiko showed us earlier of the interventions before the fact of not getting juveniles to that point. So I'll leave it there because of my internet connection. And what I'll do is probably try to call in, okay?
That would be great. Magistrate Dumler, did you have a thought on that as well?
Yeah, you know, that whole program was focused on the Black and Brown community, the early interventions too. But one of the things that we noticed when it became apparent as soon as I went to Arapahoe is the use of muni courts. They rely heavily on muni courts in Aurora. And it was intended to give the kids a break, not get them district level involved right up front, but they didn't have the services. They didn't have anything that they were offering. And what we were seeing was these kids spinning around, picking up 3-4 cases. Well, now when I do get them in district court, they're not eligible for diversion. And the problem is so bad that the intervention has to be at such a high level that it's extremely frustrating and so much harder to be successful. So we actually went to them and explained that to them. And we have now partnered with them. If a kid picks up a second case, they're now doing a DAR report, which is the Jack report. They're doing diversion. We're getting them in there. And, you know, we're really trying to work with them so that they can identify better what kid really should be with you in muni court and what should be with us, because they don't really have the power to order DHS in or, you know, but we were working with them, and they are at the table with us so that we can really pick the right kids at the right time. But there is a significant, about 1,000 a year cases in muni court for juveniles. And so a lot of them are sitting out there, and you know, you don't want them to fail up. You want the right intervention at the right time. So that's one thing that we've been working on too, to try to address that.
Jennifer, how about your jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think what I would say is I think a lot of the individual entities, you know, child welfare, probation has been looking at this idea of, you know, systemic bias and the issues that we have there. But I think as a jurisdiction, that hasn't been a big conversation we've had. But that is one of our goals for this year, is to really look at that, look at how our system is impacting that. And then I think it's well taken that I think we need to look at our services too and make sure that they are meeting the needs of those populations as well. So for us, it's the beginnings of a larger conversation and something that we will probably see some changes this year.
And so in wrapping up, because we have just about another minute for our panel, anything that Judge Moultrie didn't mention, I think I asked her, like some of the youth and the needs that she's seen. How about you, Magistrate Dumler, anything else that you think folks should hear about that you're seeing as a big need for this population? And then we'll end with Jennifer as well.
My goal, one of my goals this year, obviously, I have got to find a way to get some guns out of kids' hands. That's on my table. But one of the things that I'm seeing is we've got in the Aurora, but Arapahoe County area, we have a lot of immigrant families who do not speak English. The languages are, and some of them are so difficult to find interpreters for, that access to services is a huge barrier. But not just access to services, failure to understand how your child could be successful here in the US. Education. You know, I had a group of kids that were gang involved because they were providing for their parents. They were committing ag robs because their parents weren't taking care of them. They weren't paying the rent. They weren't providing food and those kinds of things. But those kids were going to supposedly school. And what we found out later was that some of them, we had competency raised, is that because they didn't really understand the language, they were going to school and just sitting there. They weren't learning anything. They were not doing, and the schools weren't addressing it. So that is a major problem that I really want to work on, is starting kind of somewhat similar to DBOA, but family mentoring about how to be successful here. And I really see that it comes up over and over and over again. And I want to push for that this year, is making sure we're giving really good surround services for every community.
Thank you for that. Jennifer, anything else to add?
I think to piggyback off of what Magistrate Dumler was saying, I also think a focus on supporting kin who are taking care of youth is a really big piece of that as well. If they can't be home while there are issues being worked on, then I really think kin is underutilized with our delinquency population. And looking at not only what the youth needs in their home, but what those families need, because obviously youth come with a lot of different issues. And I think it's important to make sure that we're looking at what their needs are and finding ways to support them as well.
Great. I think that Pax, or sorry, I told Pax I would do this, unfortunately. Judge Moultrie, any final words from you? I think you tried to call and I'm not hearing you. Okay, thank you. No final words. Well, a big thank you to all. I believe all three of you are going to stay on for a little bit longer. And so we'll kind of still monitor the chat. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, and we certainly will take some time to look those over. But thank you all for being here and for sharing your insight about how to engage the conversation at the local level, as well as some best practices around kind of what you're seeing and the youth that you're seeing, and some great thoughts on how to prevent out-of-home placement and services that these families really need. So a big thank you to everyone being very engaged in this panel, and I will turn it over to you, Miko.
Yes, thank you so much. And I should have said this in the beginning, that we expected there would be a lot of chats and questions coming through. And even though 3 hours sounds like a lot of time, there's not as much space for open Q&A as we would like. So I know our team is trying to respond as much as possible in writing to some of the questions. And there's also some really big questions that need more follow-up and time. And so please know we will continue to monitor questions. We'll do our best to answer either in our conversations today or through the chat. And we'll, whenever necessary, to schedule some space for follow-up or offline conversations as well. So thank you for your patience as we figure out how to respond to everyone here. So with that, I am going to call on Kristen and Norma and see if they are ready to give a perspective. I mean, that whole first panel was very much focused on services and the need for services. So Norma and Kristen are going to dig into a little bit more about the need for services and staffing. Hi, Norma.
Hi, Yumiko. How are you?
I'm good. Let's
Good.
see.
Nice to see you.
And do you want to introduce yourself real quick, Norma, before you go into your piece?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, Kristen, if I remember correctly, you're going to start and then I'll sort of chime in. Is that correct?
Norma, thank you so much for being here. Why don't you go ahead and start with a discussion of the reimagined staffings, and talk to us a little bit about how that group came to be and what it does and why it works. And then we can talk about our detention placement process mapping group, and we can share with you all some of the ideas that came out of that.
Awesome. Okay. So, hi, my name is Norma Aguilar-Dave, and I'm the executive director of Savio House, a treatment provider here in Colorado. So, reimagined staffings came about as an idea of how could we do a better job of staffing, getting a good sort of set of clinical people in the room with, with county folks and GALs and the entire treatment team for a child. And how could we do a really good job of thinking, sort of seeing the case holistically? So looking at protective factors, trying to mitigate risk for kids, all of that stuff for kids and families. And how could we do that in a way that made sense to get everybody in the room to talk about a child and come up with a treatment plan and then have some follow-up to that treatment plan. So basically what we did was we have 3 providers. So it's Savio, Shiloh, and Tennyson. And the reason we started with these 3 providers is because these 3 providers were working together on the quarantine bed stuff that had to happen when counties in the state came and asked, first came and said to Savio, since we had closed our residential program, said, could we use those beds that are not being used right now? And I can't see myself, Kristen, so I don't know if where my head is on the screen, if you guys can see me or not. I'm not sure why I can't see myself, but I can. So I just want to make sure you know that.
I can see you, and Now I see a little toy on the floor, but a moment ago I saw you just fine. There you are.
Okay,
Perfect.
sorry. So anyway, so it came about from the quarantine beds. Savio said, yes, we can reopen our residential beds to use them for quarantine beds, but there are providers that already have beds open that might be willing to join to help, meet this need. And so hence came a partnership and a collaboration between Savio, Shiloh, and Tennyson Center. So the way that reimagined staffings work right now is there are some counties that are doing these with us, where Savio is the facilitator of the staffings. And so we have a Savio person, a clinical person at Savio, actually our old residential coordinator. So she understands residential really, really well, has a fairly good understanding about the services that are out there outside of Savio also. And so a county will come and say, okay, we want to staff a child. And so we will staff the child. Savio will be there, Tennyson and Shiloh in terms of their clinical folks. And then we have all of the treatment team on the case. And we also have a Medicaid person there to help. So we're trying to figure out funding for services also. And the goal is to not only prevent an out-of-home placement, because if an out-of-home placement is needed, it's needed. And we get that. But it really is to treatment plan and look at what is the best service for the child. Why does that child need that service? And then if it is that they have to go into placement, how are we going to get them out of placement effectively, efficiently? And how are we going, what are we going to, where is that child going to go from that placement? Because sometimes home isn't an option immediately, but if it is, we want to be able to get in there really quickly and get that home ready for the kid. So the other part that Savio plays is that we then are sort of the broker of making sure that everyone is doing all of the things that they have committed to do, so that everyone on the team is following through with the steps that we have outlined in the staffing. And so, for example, everyone gets really busy, and then what we know for sure is that, crisis that hit go on the top of our list. And so then we sort of forget about, oh, we were supposed to do this thing for this kid, and now it's 3 months later and it still isn't done. And so our role is to try to help folks just stay on track with that stuff. And so, if we said that, Savio was going to do X thing, then we're making sure we're contacting Savio and saying, okay, have you done this yet? And if not, why not? How can we be of help? Is it that the service or the resource is not available? And so we've got to come back to the table and try to find something different. So we're just kind of keeping the ball rolling. That's really the role of the Savio person right now, is to keep the ball rolling on that treatment plan, making sure that people are following through with what we said we were going to do, and then evaluating whether or not that is working for this child. So one of the things that I heard folks say, and that I heard Jennifer say in specific, was that there's that need to have lots of resources, but there's also the need to have diversity in resources, right? And diversity in services. And so and the need for ongoing assessment and reevaluation. And so that's what, this specific role does, is continually is assessing and reevaluating whether or not the plan that's in place is working for the child and family. And if it's not working, then bringing it back to the table and talking about why isn't it working and what are we going to do about it? How can we intervene before it gets to a point of crisis for the child and family? So in a nutshell, that's what reimagined staffings are. They have evolved. They didn't start like this, but that's where we are today with it. So we have contracts with a number of different counties to facilitate these staffings in this sort of hopefully new and innovative way.
Thank you so much, Norma. And Norma was kind enough to participate in a group that we facilitated for about maybe, what do you think, say 6 weeks or so, toward the end of the summer, early fall. As many of you are aware, some of you very, very aware, we have struggled with young people who are in detention and releasable, and how do we really speed up that process of when a young person becomes releasable, to get them quickly out of detention and get them in a place that's appropriate for them, whether that be at home or in some kind of a foster care placement or facility placement. And so we had this process mapping group with many of you who are on this call, including Norma, and we were really looking at the question of how can we improve the process to get these young people more quickly out of detention? And as I think Jennifer Mullenbach said earlier, in a different context, we started with one question, and then our answer and our question really turned into something bigger, because these young people who are in detention, it's really a moment in time for them, but the issues that are impacting how they got there and where they will go after really is much more of a whole systems issue. And any solution we found that we were coming up with, and any ideas we were coming up with, really relied on looking at the whole system. And so a couple of kind of big and exciting ideas came out of that group that we wanted to share with you all today. And they're kind of related to the reimagined staffings. And I think, Norma and others who had been a part of that work, that there was sort of a natural connection of trying to just break down these conceptual walls about how things have to work and how things have always been, and thinking of new ways that we could collaborate and use resources. So one of those ideas was a centralized multidisciplinary group that could consider the needs of individual youth and make recommendations about placement or services. And when I say centralized, I mean like actually at the state level. So we had talked about this issue that we have kind of currently with trying to identify placement, that there can be sort of what I think of as a vacancy rate kind of problem. Like there's almost a gridlock where you have placement packets on a young person maybe going out to everywhere, but no place is quite the perfect fit. And there's such a scarcity or perception of scarcity that whoever says yes is kind of maybe where that young person has to go. And it's all feeling kind of emergent and not necessarily the most tailored to actually really looking at that individual youth and their case and their needs, and building either a placement or a package of services or both that actually serves them. It's more just about like, how do we get them out of detention and where do we put them? And so this centralized, the idea of this centralized group is that we might have a clinician, we might have somebody who represents the provider perspective, we might have somebody who represents maybe a specific knowledge around a specific area for that young person's needs, such as somebody who's an expert in intellectual and developmental disabilities or offense-specific treatment, or whatever their needs are. And that we kind of convene this group of people who has more of a bird's eye view of the whole state and could say, okay, looking at this individual youth, what are the things that they need, and how could we piece together a more comprehensive and holistic plan and placement, if it involves placement, that would allow this young person to have their needs met in the least restrictive setting. Norma, would you like to kind of add more to that, and how you can conceive of this idea and how it might work?
Yeah, I think, and you did a great job, so I don't know what more I can add, but I think, it's looking at collaboration, especially for providers, in a whole different way, in my opinion. And so, it's really having someone who has a clear clinical understanding of the landscape of services that exist in Colorado. It's really having providers be able to be a lot more mobile. And so, being able to provide services in rural communities that should, and where families should have the same options in terms of diversity of services that, kids and families in Denver have, for example, or in Arapahoe County or anything like that. And so, so it's really just collaborating again, in my humble opinion, in a whole different way than what we've been used to doing. And really saying, oh, having somebody who has a clear understanding of everything that is out there to say, okay, so in this particular, county or community, if we're looking for this kind of a service, this is the provider that can hit that community, right? This is a provider that can get to a child and family in that community. And this is the service that we can offer here that sort of, meets the needs of the family and the child, or gets as close as possible to meet the need that's identified for that child and family. And so, like Kristen said, it's a centralized multidisciplinary group of folks, in my opinion, that you need to be able to have some really some skilled clinical people on that team to be able to really ask some targeted assessment questions about a family, so that hopefully we're getting, the services in place, the right service in place right from the onset, or at least being willing to look for the right services. And then, I think the hope for providers would be that, we're going to be able to identify gaps in services. And so that gives providers an opportunity to meet those gaps, right? To fill those gaps, to say, okay, so if I'm really good at this, and I'll use us as an example, right? Savio House, I most of we believe in evidence-based models. We have a number of evidence-based models under our belt. And so, if so for us, it might be a little bit easier to start an evidence-based model than an agency that has never done them. And so, if there's an evidence-based model out there that's needed in the community, maybe then that's something that Savio says, okay, so we're going to step up to the table and bring that in. And if there's, another service that's needed that, Family Tree is really good at providing or has some knowledge about that, then they may say, okay, we don't do exactly this, but we do something similar. So now we're going to step up and provide this exact service that we know now the community needs, right? So I just feel like it would be an opportunity for us to collaborate in a different way, and to really expand the types of services that we're able to offer families.
Thanks, Norma. I'm looking in the chat and not seeing any specific questions on this. I think we have a couple minutes. Yumiko, shake your head no if that's not the case. I think we have a couple of minutes that we could answer any specific questions that folks have. I do see a comment that that reimagined staffings have been great in identifying needs, but we still don't have the programs or providers to meet those needs. And as we go into our breakout groups, I think imagining what would meet the needs is a really critical question that we need answered. If in my kind of vision of what we would be, how we would be able to implement these concepts that Norma and I are sharing right now, is that we would have within a 2-hour radius or virtually, available every critical service. So, does that mean remote access for some things, or how do we do that? How do we identify what is the critical menu of services that must be available everywhere in Colorado? And that's
Kristen,
something that we need your perspective on.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think, and Charlene is right? She's, Charlene has taken part in these reimagined staffings with us. And so, and I think that's sort of part of what I was saying before, right? If we have this centralized group of people that have knowledge about, cases in all of Colorado, then we start seeing what are the resources and the services that are not available. And then, we're able to develop those services, and you have an idea of how many kids are we looking at, right? So obviously it's not a good business plan for a provider to come up with a new service for one child and family. That can't happen, right? Providers just can't make that happen. But if we have an idea that, wow, in Colorado, if we had this one service, yeah, we could probably easily, refer 20 kids into that service at any given time or something like that. Well, now all of a sudden, now we can start looking to providers and saying, so you're really good at something like this. Would you be interested in starting a program that we think we could, keep it going? So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's sort of my thought behind that in terms of how that affects providers and our ability to be creative about the services that we can offer families.
I think it makes perfect sense. It makes sense to me that this is, really an iterative kind of process, and that flexibility and being, adaptive to the needs as they change for communities is part of what we have to be able to do. We have to be able to respond to changing needs and changing demographics and mobility of service providers within regions or virtually, or however we can make that happen so that there's a little bit more of an economy of scale. It might not make sense for one provider in a region to create a service for one person, but if you look at the entire state and find a way to efficiently make that expertise available to the practitioners who might be across the state and to support one another, then we can really start to meet the needs, even when we might only see a need crop up in a given geographic area, not very frequently, but we still have the ability to, draw from our collective knowledge and help each other.
I'm going to add that kind of circling back to family first, what that also gives us on top of this is an opportunity for certain services as a state to access federal resources to continue reinvesting into growing and scaling services across the state, right? So I love that idea of kind of this iterative process of better understanding needs, identifying the gaps, right? And continuing to build out the strategy of how do we keep growing services while utilizing some of the resources we're getting from Family First. So I think these pieces are all fitting together in that way too.
I totally agree, Yumiko, with that statement. I think, yes, Families First is saying that they, in order to get funding from the feds, you have to provide evidence-based models, but it does not say that is the only way that you can treat children and families, right? And so I think there is some space for a number of things, and and I hear what folks are saying about MST and FFT not working for gang kids, and there is an FFT model that we are bringing to the table, FFTG, that is specifically intended to work with gang kids. So to that intervention. So, more to come on that. But I also think that in terms of MST and FFT and their work with minority populations, I don't, there's a lot to talk about there, because I don't necessarily agree with the statement that it doesn't work for minority populations. We certainly have seen a lot of success with both of those models with that population. And so, but, I think that's probably a whole other conversation. So.
I was just reading Amy's response in the chat there, and I think it's a good segue to breaking out into discussion groups. And so thank you so much to all of our panelists. Now the challenge before all of us is to soak in all of this great thinking and information from different perspectives and move into interactive discussion about now where do we go? And so what we're going to move into now is the design phase of the discussion. So here's another quote: as human-centered designers, we are persistently focused on what could be, not the countless obstacles that may get in the way. Constraints are inevitable, and often they push us towards unexpected solutions. So that's difficult to do, right? It's actually very easy to talk about all the challenges and barriers that we all face and that all these children and youth face. But just for the next hour or so, we're going to try to get in the world of an individual child or youth through these use cases and build out what could the system look like for this youth, right? So for 1 hour, try to stay in this space of dreaming of what could be possible. And then we can have all those other discussions about all the barriers and how we can overcome them. And so we are going to break you out into smaller groups. and have a facilitator in each of those groups. And again, your challenge is really to read through your use case and then think through, what does that child or youth need to be successful in terms of services, in terms of placement options, any variety of things. We're going to be using Jamboards in our groups, which is essentially a virtual whiteboard. And I'll show you that in 1 minute. But as a group, you're going to first read through your use case, use the Jamboard to just brainstorm and get all your ideas out. Pretend you're in the room together with a bunch of sticky notes and markers. We want to promote, at this point, quantity, right? Get all your ideas out, focus on creativity again, not feasibility. And then I will, as a group, you're going to look for patterns and themes and start honing in on kind of your top ideas. Because we want you to leave us with kind of your best ideas for what we can really work on refining and building out over the next several months. Okay, so again, when you get into your breakout rooms, give us a minute. You will eventually get a link in your chat in your breakout room. You'll each have a case study to read through. Your Jamboard is going to look something like this, where you're going to use sticky notes to write down all your various ideas. And then you can move things around and group things and star things and cross things out as you want to on that board. And again, the ultimate goal is to leave us with some of your best concepts that we can then move forward, engage in further conversation to further refine them and turn them into action. So those are the next steps. We are going to put you in breakout rooms. So you should automatically be put in a breakout room. Once we get to those rooms, you'll have a facilitator and we'll build in a break into the small group sessions. This is such a long 3-hour session, so don't worry about that. And then after, I think we'll do about 45-50 minutes in breakouts, and then we'll come back together quickly and close out for the day. So let me just check with some of my colleagues here and make sure I didn't miss anything logistically before we break out. Okay, so I think we've got it. I think we've got the technology down. This is our third collaborative, so we had a lot of rehearsals to get this figured out. So hang tight. You're going to go into breakout rooms shortly and you'll meet with your facilitators there. Okay, so thank you all. We'll see you in a bit.